Hi, welcome to Inner Athlete Training Podcast. I'm your host, James Jankowicz, and we are on episode number 2. And we are going to take a deep dive into the history of physical culture. Where did this all begin? How did it begin? Under what circumstances did it all begin? This is going to be a heck of a journey. So strap yourself in, take some notes, and let's get started. Now, it would be assumed that a lot of this would launch from Greece, and to a large part that is correct. However, there are other regions that deserve an honorable mention, namely Egypt, Sumer, and China. So we're going to spend a little time on those three. Some of them preceded the Greek culture, some of them may have been running concurrently, but we're going to look at those ideas. And where Greece really came about was they took all the preceding ideas and they were very good at bringing them into their culture, throwing them into the wash cycle of philosophical ideas and finding out which ones worked, which were the most productive, and then pushing it out toward the rest of Western civilization. But we'll get into Greece next podcast. But for right now, I do want to spend this time traveling through Sumer, Egypt, and China. So Sumer, land of the Sumerians, was also known as Mesopotamia back, about 5,000 years ago. And it was known as the cradle of civilization. It was pretty much the first time man stopped roaming and pitched his tent and made a home. And the reason they were able to do this was because the term Sumer itself pretty much just means between two rivers. And the two rivers that surrounded Sumer were the Tigris and the Euphrates. So there was a very lush environment by which things can grow, by which you can hop in a boat and go downstream and do commerce, by which you can grow all your berries and all your wheats and everything else that you needed to grow, and have enough water and food for your livestock. So it was all the right environment to produce and develop a culture and a society. It was the first time that we went from a roaming culture, right? So we're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 years BC, give or take. And the first time we went to an agrarian society, or some people call it an agricultural society. So it was the first time we no longer had to roam from place to place and hunt the next prey or find the next berry. We were able to just kind of like make it all happen within that region. Sumer also was known for creating cuneiform. Cuneiform was one of the first forms of communication, one of the first languages. So that helped facilitate communication amongst themselves and subsequently amongst other cultures. Babylon and Assyria were also evolving around the same time. The Sumerians believed in a plurality of gods, right? So they would look at the sky and they would look at the weather and they would give a name or an identity to a personality and create many, many gods. This was long before the Abrahamic faiths came along and said, no, there's one God. Now, they also believed, like many ancient people did, that their whole purpose in life was to serve these gods and goddesses, right? So they were put here on the earth to follow their commandments, to be servants to them. So we see that if you ever watch the History Channel and you ever watch Ancient Aliens, talk about a show that begins with a conclusion and works back. That show sort of provides the same explanation, except they're not saying they're gods. They're saying that they were aliens and that we were seeded by aliens and that our whole purpose is to somehow be mined and crafted and be obedient to these aliens and to do their bidding. And this is exactly the way the ancient Sumerians saw it, and a lot of ancient culture saw it when it came to many gods and goddesses. So it's not a new idea. It's a new idea for us when we watch Ancient Aliens, because we just take that old idea of the plurality of gods and we insert this idea of ancient aliens because we have a technological sophistication now that they certainly didn't have back then. But we're just going to say that there's a similarity of ideas, right, that we see today in modernity that actually started back in antiquity. They had an idea about their bodies, right? And this idea of their bodies was not a favorable one amongst the commoner. The body was sort of something to be kind of ashamed about. They didn't really venerate it at the time. They didn't really celebrate it. And as with every society and every culture, there is a ruling class. So this ruling class had to persuade the people somehow that they should be the rulers and that they should be the ones in charge, right? So how do they do this? Basically, they did it by saying that they would be the intercessors to the gods, right? We would be their diplomats. We would do their bidding. We would be here communicating to them. They would tell us what to do, and we would tell you what to do. And this was the first, I would say, rather clever way of gaining control over a population. And how did they do that? So if the common person had a very lowly perception of their body, then to differentiate oneself as a king or as a god, you had to have a different disposition. So the kings and the gods were able to express and celebrate their individuality, whereas the common people did not. And how did the kings separate themselves visually? Well, they did it as kings do. They wore the finest linens. They separated by wearing the finest clothing that they can derive at the time. But basically they're saying, hey, we're different, right? We wear these priestly robes because we're the ones intercessing with the gods and goddesses. Where do we see that? We see that a lot in pop culture, right? We see that a lot when you have people like musicians that I always admired, Prince and David Bowie. They always dressed outrageously. They rarely dressed in average clothing. And then people would venerate them on stage and we would cheer them on. And it was the same sort of mentality. It's a very ancient primal instinct to separate yourself from the crowd. These particular celebrities, they had a certain god worship component, right? But they weren't claiming to be gods, at least as far as I know. But they did have a skill set. They were phenomenal musicians or phenomenal actors or whatever the case may be. So that was a way of differentiating them from the pack. And they would dress in an ornate way to exaggerate that differentiation. Now, how did the Sumerian rulers at the time lay claim to that particular position, right? They did it through initiation. And this is something that happens in the ancient cultures all the time. And in this particular case, the kings would say that they had a matrimony, a marriage. They had a marriage to a goddess called Inanna. And Inanna was also known as Ishtar. So it was through this matrimony, through this marriage, that the kings would then solidify their fate as kings, as God's representatives. Basically, you're talking about a goddess of fertility, a goddess of war, goddess of justice, goddess of sex. So she was a prize. So if you could marry her, you're in. Just don't piss her off. So it was through that matrimony they sealed their relationship as kings. As Sumer evolved, trade, travel, commerce, warfare started to become the norm. So like every civilization, holding your status of power meant defending your homeland. And how did you do that? Well, you developed an army. And what was that army made out of? It was made out of warriors. So warriors knew that they'd get invaded. We could argue that the beginning of physical culture was really an attempt to figure out how can I be bigger, faster, and stronger than the invading army so I can defeat them? Or how can we be bigger, faster, and stronger than the town or the army that we actually want to invade? Right? So now it became a race to figure out, what can I do to be better? Well, they had little competitions. If 10 guys were around and one could pick up a rock, then the one who could pick up the rock was the strongest, then that person was venerated, to say the least, right? You're the strong guy. And, if one person beat everybody else in the foot races, then, well, you're the fast guy. Here we see where we start to see the beginning seeds where athleticism was now starting to directly correlate to warriorship. So one of the most famous Sumerian kings, let's say, was the legendary Gilgamesh. He was a rather flawed human being and a rather flawed king. I'm not going to go into the whole story of Gilgamesh. You can find that easily online. But in general, what did Gilgamesh do? He was set out on historic journeys. And he set out on historic journeys to slay demons and supernatural entities in the woods. So there began a mythology around this idea of warriorship, right? So when you painted the image of going to war with something supernatural and you were conquering what was indeed evil, this was the mechanism they would use to inspire the soldiers who were going into more, let's say, mundane combat, right? Where they would have to kill another human being, or they would have to pillage a town, or whatever the case may be, right? It's not as romantic of an idea as going in and slaying a demon, but this was the higher arching narrative, the mythology, if you would, to start using to inspire people to go to war. So now we start to see where this interesting kind of intersection, where there was warriorship, because there was honor in defending the homeland, and making yourself a physically superior warrior. And then you married that to this supernatural idea. And so this is where we really see the intersection of these ideas of warriorship, spirituality, and athleticism. We start to see the seeds of them start to grow. Because like with any ruler, when it comes to war, you have to paint a very persuasive argument to go to war. Otherwise, why bother, right? So it has to be a good justification, and they used stories like that of Gilgamesh and other type of mythologies to encourage the people, to give them a higher, more transcendent ideal by which they can use as a template to then go in and fight their battles and give those battles meaning and context. Our own modern day had a resurgence like this somewhere in the 1800s, but you had an emerging in this country of a Protestant movement known as muscular Christianity. And they used that idea to train young men to be warriors. It was the same idea, except it was done under the guise of Christianity. And it was that movement that actually took us to the modern day YMCA, right? So that's a whole interesting story, which we'll get to down the road. So again, just trying to compare something that happened in antiquity to something that occurred more in modernity. In time, archaeologists would eventually discover artifacts of Sumerians training in all sorts of combat sports. Wrestling, okay, we understand that because when two guys get into a fight, they go to the ground and they wrestle. But you also saw etchings of boxing. And we're talking about 3,000 to 1,500 BC. Fishing and boating. So now all these activities that became essential to your survival then became sport, right? Because now it's like, okay, well, who can be the best at this? And who can fish, who can catch the biggest fish, who can get the boat out to the water the quickest, who can don the sail, who can do whatever they do the quickest and most efficient. So these mundane activities started branching out and became very friendly, kind of like internal competitions within the community, right? And it made them better, right? And that's the idea of competition. When it's done in a healthy way, it makes you better. It keeps pushing you to a higher level that you wouldn't normally attain on your own. The warriorship, the readiness, the mundane tasks, all sort of kind of culminated into this idea of sport. They weren't calling it back then, but they were doing these menial tasks in a recreational, competitive way. There's a lot more we can say about Sumer, but we're not going to, right? Because I want to hop over to Egypt now. So like the Sumerians, or the Mesopotamians at the time, Egypt had the Nile River. So it wasn't in between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. It had the Nile, but it was the same kind of situation. They were set up in a really good position where they had lush greenery, where they had a waterway for communication and transportation. Like any other nation state at the time or any other culture, they were not immune from attacks. You always had to be on the guard for attacks. So Egypt was no different, and their warriorship took this athletic idea and developed it even further. First of all, if you were a young man and you decided to be that warrior, you decided to go into the Egyptian army, you would actually be plucked from your family for a time. You would actually go off to barracks and be beaten, right? And you'd be beaten just to make a man out of you and to be tough. And then you would return to your family only when certain campaigns were ended. And there were two primary skills the Egyptian warrior really had to master. And one was foot speed and one was archery. So they determined at that time, hey, these are probably two of the most important things. So who's ever best at this will be our best warriors. Now, they were also engaging in strength competitions. And their strength competitions went from picking up stones to actually picking up bags of sand, like the original deadlift, right? You just pick up a bag of sand and then press it up over the head. So these things started at a very early period in antiquity, and this impulse to pick up heavy things and put them down, I think is still as primal today as it was back then, because it just feels good, right? There's a certain feeling that comes with cardio. There's a certain endorphin, a certain release, a certain high, but there's a certain one that also comes with lifting heavy things, doing weight training or resistance training. That's different. They feel different, both equally good, but there's something very measurable about the weight training, because it's like, hey, I'm measurably lifting more weight now than I did a week ago. So it's a good feeling. And when you get that pump, that pump is what guys live for and wish they could have throughout the day. Egypt, through their 27 centuries, which is quite a large span of time, they developed their warriorship. And their warriorship wasn't limited to just soldiers. Pharaohs were obliged to be in good condition too. So if you were a pharaoh and you made it to your first 30 years, you had to re-up your athletic skills. You had to prove to the people that you were still physically capable. They didn't look at you just as a great leader or a great intellect or a brave man, whatever the case may be. You had to prove it. And how did they prove it? Once they hit their 30-year mark, the pharaoh would then have to participate in what they called the Hebsed Festival, Hebsed Festival. And that was named after an Egyptian wolf god. And during the festival, it was incumbent upon the pharaoh to participate in 3 distinct physical activities: strength, endurance, and archery. Archery was crucial back then. The strength component was to lift a djed, or a pillar, with a rope. So in other words, the rope would be thrown around the other side and you would have to lift the thing from the other side of the rope. Then they also had to run laps, and they had to run around a track approximately 8 times, and they had to do it with a bull by the side. And then lastly, the bow and arrow was the archery. So it was a matter of running from one station, stopping and shooting, running to another station, stopping and shooting. So this whole idea of speed and quickness and agility, really started back then as well. They didn't have Nike or Adidas sneakers to do it well, but the science of having to accelerate, decelerate, stop, change direction, and accelerate again, which is a skill that is taught nowadays, was something that they just had to teach themselves. But it was crucial to their survival, because you had a serpentine. You couldn't just be in the way of a moving arrow, right? So you had to really learn how to move around. So, man, wouldn't it be amazing to see our current leaders having to do that as well, right? If you've been the president for 4 years, then you should have to do something physical in order to, prove that you're still capable of doing what you're doing. I know Joe Biden often challenges people to push-ups. I never want to see that, because I don't think it would end well for poor Joe. But anyway, you get the idea. There's always this male instinct to compete upon one another, when it comes to physical tasks. And this is really where the root of physical culture really started. It was, how do I be a better warrior? How do I be a stronger warrior? How do I be a quicker warrior? How can I shoot better? How can I sail better? How can I do all these things that are required for not only my personal survival, but in order to defend the homeland, right? So these were not small tasks. So athleticism, warriorship, and a sense of spiritual purpose was all coming together at this time. We saw the beginning of the javelin in Egypt. We saw the beginning of field hockey. There's actually inscriptions of Egyptians practicing some kind of field hockey. They also did wrestling. They also did boxing. And when it came to death, the Egyptians, in large part, just saw death as another part of the journey that also required physical and mental discipline. Right? So this was a big part of who they were. You couldn't just sit there and bang on your computer all day. Your physical acumen was contingent upon your survival. And that's something that we don't experience today. We can neglect ourselves for decades and reap the fruit of it as we get older, as we deteriorate, and reap the consequences of not having trained our whole lives. And then if something goes wrong, well, we have medication, we have drugs, we can have pills that facilitate us. But this was not the case back then. And I would make an argument, and as the inner athlete training dictates, we do make an argument that you should train as though your life depends on it. Because, well, someday it may, right? Someday you may have to perform on a level that you don't want to be not ready for, right? So it's important to understand that our whole understanding of physical culture and training comes from a survival instinct. And I think if we tap into that a little more deeply, I think that will give us more context and more meaning to the type of training we do. Even though we live in a completely different world, we should not try to escape those primal instincts that are still within our genes, that are still floating within our DNA. But now we're going to take a little trip and we're going to hop on over to China. We're going to go roughly 2,500 years BC. And that's when we see the beginning of China's cultural history really start to emerge. And we have archaeological evidence that tells us games and organized sports existed in China prior to the birth of Christ. So that's quite a while ago. And China their early days were feudalism. China was composed of city-states that were always warring with each other. We'll go back to China's physical culture as far back as the Peking man, who lived over 5,000 years ago. So like Sumer in Egypt, a large part of Chinese physical culture evolved around the warrior's training. Boxing would come to China around 527 AD. Its initial iteration of boxing was pretty much 18 offensive moves that the student had to master. And you find this with a lot of the Eastern arts. It's a series of moves. Judo has a prescribed amount of moves. It's not this infinite amount of things that you do. You know, it's a prescribed amount that you then have to spend the rest of your life mastering. Right? And that was the whole interesting perspective that the Chinese of the Eastern culture brought to their training. Like, they didn't let it go into infinity. They said, we're going to just find out what the basics are of this thing, and we're going to master those basics. And we're going to pound those basics in, so it just becomes second nature. And we're not going to get too lost in an infinite amount of movement. Now we're talking about 1070 AD. There was a boxing instructor from China named Qiu Yangshang. He expanded the movements from 18 to roughly 170 and solidified a set of training rules, which included, now we're getting out of the realm of training, a vegetarian diet, sexual control, and lots of self-discipline. So this was an essential component to warriorship, because if you were going to be good, you had to have a clear mind, and it couldn't be clogged up and fogged up by trivial daily concerns. You had to be able to get out there, and you had to be able to execute, literally, on a high level, right? So keeping your mind clear and your thoughts clean was essential to warriorship as warriorship evolved, right? Because they just found that they were better performers when they did all the right things, just like we are today. If you get enough sleep, if you spend some time in prayer and meditation, and you keep your mind clean, and you keep your mind sharp, and you keep training your body in an efficient way, you just perform better whatever your tasks happen to be. A lot of the movements that came out of Chinese culture were influenced by several different things, right? Influenced by observing nature. So there were a lot of moves that came about just by watching how animals move and how animals conduct themselves. You know, the way you crawl on the ground, the way you claw, and the way you grab. Like, these were all ideas that they were integrated into their fighting styles. There were other ideas that were taken from staring at the constellations. All right, so they would stare at the constellations, and they would figure out different personalities that would emerge through the constellations. The whole idea of martial, you hear the term martial arts, right? That came from the term martial itself came from the planet Mars, right? Because that was in the Roman idea, that was the god of war, right? So All of this came from a very naturalistic, almost arguably a pagan worldview, where they took all these ideas in nature and they integrated them. And it wasn't just the warriorship. They would also observe how things went in cycles and how animals would then explode and do what they had to do and conquer, but then they would rest and they would relax, right? And they would look at the constellations and they would see the cycle of things. And they integrated all these ideas into their, not only into their day-to-day philosophy, Chinese philosophy, but also into their movements and how they would actually conduct themselves in a warrior type of way. Training methodologies in the Chinese martial arts were ramped up with disciplines such as holding long horse stances, right? This was something you didn't see in the West. So you see this in different types of martial arts where they just hold those stances for like long periods of time. And it wasn't just about the strength that you would gain, but it was also about the mental discipline. Because when you hold an uncomfortable position for a long period of time, it really becomes a mental chess game. It's a great practice, and it's something we encourage here on the Inner Athlete, and we have our own methodologies by which to do that, which we'll get into further down the road. And they were a smaller people, right? So because they weren't big, they were smaller, they were faster, they were more agile. They can get from point A to point B much faster, than a Greco-Roman warrior, for example. So they really use that to their advantage. And generally speaking, Chinese people have very fast twitch muscle fibers, right? Which makes them very quick at kicking and hitting and running and jumping. And this happens a lot with smaller people too, because oftentimes they had to impress themselves and impress upon other people their abilities more so than somebody who's big. Somebody who's bigger is not necessarily going to get, let's say, hassled as much, right? But somebody who's smaller might, and they might have more to defend, so they might put a lot more time into training and fighting than you might think, right? So it's always a good idea to never underestimate your opponent in any way, shape, or form. Shaolin monks really took the pain to a different level in terms of their discipline. They have a variety of exercises and trainings that they would do that required long static stances as well as very dynamic movements. Obviously, the punching of boards, the punching of rope, the punching of concrete. All these things that subsequently made them very tough and very resilient. So those were a whole bunch of training methodologies where you really start to see the beginning of physical training and physical culture, and knowing that it all kind of evolved out of this sense of warriorship. Like, how can I be the biggest, fastest, strongest person in order to defend the homeland or to successfully conquer the next invading land? So as time goes on and war was not always a necessity, we didn't lose that instinct. We kept that instinct and we kept training to be physically active, and that's good. But again, as we go deeper into this, you'll find that we here at Inner Athlete Training really encourage the idea of training as though your life depends on it, because it's not a bad place to start, right? It's really not a bad place to start. And speaking of a place to start and a place to end, we're going to end this here. So that was just a very small primer on Sumer, Egypt, and China. And next podcast, we're going to take a deep dive into the Greek culture, where all these ideas really came together and got battled out and sussed out in the form of ideas, and kind of took the best of what worked and what didn't, and then pushed it out to the remainder of Western civilization. So it's a compelling story. And so join us on episode 3 of the Inner Athlete Training Podcast, and we will see you there.